Welcome back, friend. Today, we are diving into the daily life of a Soviet soldier. What did they do when they woke up? How did they spend their long days in training in camp and on the front lines? And what small routines kept them going through some of the harshest conditions of the 20th century? From early morning drills to food rations from letters sent home to the long nights in the barracks, we are going to walk step by step through the ordinary and often exhausting routines of Soviet soldiers during wartime. But before you get comfortable, make sure you have hit that subscribe button and drop your city name along with your local time in the comments so we know exactly where in the world you are watching us from. When you think about the life of a Soviet soldier during the years of the Second World War, or even in the decades after, it is easy to picture them always marching across snowy battlefields or standing at attention in the shadow of the Kremlin. But the truth is that most of their days were filled with ordinary routines that blended discipline with monotony. The daily life of a Soviet soldier was a strange mix of harsh discipline, constant surveillance, comradeship, and moments of surprising humanity. And to understand their world, we should start with their mornings. The morning for a Soviet soldier began before the sun had a chance to rise. The sound of a whistle or a commanding voice would break the silence of the barracks, and every man would scramble out of his rough cot. Soldiers slept in long shared dormitories where rows of bunks lined the walls, and personal space was a luxury rarely afforded. Each bed had to be made with military precision corners, tucked tight blankets, folded perfectly because inspections were frequent and mistakes were not tolerated. A messy bed was not just a personal failing, it was seen as an insult to discipline. And discipline was the very core of the Red Army once the soldiers had shaken off their grogginess. The day began with physical training. Physical culture, as the Soviets proudly called it, was considered essential, not only for health, but for building a spirit of unity. Every morning, soldiers ran in formation through the camp or nearby streets, no matter the season or the weather. In winter, their breath rose in clouds as their boots crunched across icy paths. In summer, the sweat soaked their uniforms as they pushed through long sprints, push-ups, pull-ups, and endless calisthenics. The idea was to harden the body and sharpen the mind because the Soviet state believed a soldier must always be ready. After training, the men returned to the barracks for washing, but the facilities were often far from comfortable. Imagine a large, communal washroom with cold water pouring from cracked faucets. Soldiers splashed their faces awake, sometimes shivering in winter when pipes froze and water turned to icy streams. Soap was rationed and towels were shared, so cleanliness was often more symbolic than real. But still, the ritual was important. The army wanted to mold every man into someone who looked uniform, polished and ready to serve. Breakfast came next in the mess hall. Food was never meant to be luxurious. Instead, it was practical. Fuel for men expected to march, fight, and endure. The meals often consisted of black bread, watery porridge, cabbage soup, or sometimes boiled potatoes. On special days, soldiers might receive a small portion of meat or a boiled egg. But luxuries, like butter or sugar, were rare. The food was heavy and plain, yet it filled the stomach enough to carry them through hours of drills. The Soviet system emphasized equality, which meant that officers ate better than regular soldiers, but still far less, extravagantly, than in many Western armies. Once breakfast was done, the real core of the day began. Drills and training filled almost every waking hour. Soldiers marched in formation across open yards, rifles resting on their shoulders. Every step had to be perfectly timed. Every shout of command had to be obeyed instantly. Repetition was the heart of this system, because the army believed that by drilling endlessly, a soldier's body would act without hesitation in real combat. Hours were spent dismantling and reassembling rifles, practicing with bayonets, and learning how to crawl through mud under barbed wire. It was exhausting, repetitive, and often mind-numbing, but it built a mechanical discipline that commanders trusted. Beyond physical, training soldiers also had political education. Each day included a mandatory session where officers or political commissars lectured the men on Marxist-Leninist ideology. These were not optional gatherings. A soldier had to sit straight, listen carefully, and absorb the lessons of loyalty to the Soviet Union. The speeches reminded them constantly that they were not just individuals, but defenders of the workers' state, facing constant threats from capitalist enemies. This ideological training was considered just as important as learning to shoot a rifle, because the Soviet leadership believed a soldier needed both strength and conviction to endure war. What made these mornings bearable for many was the sense of comradeship shared among the soldiers. These were young men, often from poor rural villages, who found themselves suddenly in a new world of strict rules and relentless schedules. In the rare moments of pause, laughter might ripple through the barracks. Jokes were whispered about the stiffness of their officers or about the miserable bread they were served. A harmonica might appear. Someone might hum a folk song from their home village, and for a brief moment the barracks felt less like a prison and more like a community. That bond of brotherhood was one of the few comforts they carried. Still, life was never free from fear. A soldier who failed to obey orders or made mistakes during drills could be punished severely. Punishments ranged from humiliating tasks like cleaning latrines to confinement or even worse. In the Soviet system, discipline was enforced with an iron hand, because loyalty and order were considered the only things that could keep such a massive army functioning. Officers were constantly watching, and political commissars ensured that no one dared to question authority. This meant that even a simple morning could feel tense, as every man worried about being singled out. By midday, the soldiers were physically drained from hours of running, marching, drilling, and listening to endless lectures. Their uniforms often soaked with sweat, their stomachs rumbling again from the meager breakfast. They had already lived through more discipline before lunch than most civilians experienced in an entire day. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the soldiers adapted. The Soviet system prized endurance above all else. And if a man could survive the relentless mornings, he was considered strong enough to endure the battlefield. So when we ask what a Soviet soldier did in daily life, the first answer is simple. They woke early. They trained relentlessly. They ate simply. They listened to ideology, and they endured. It was a life stripped of comfort, filled instead with repetition, discipline, and a constant reminder that they were just small parts of a larger machine. And yet, within that machine, moments of humanity still flickered when a soldier smiled at his comrade or shared a joke across the barracks. Because even in the cold structure of the Soviet army, life was still life, and men still found ways to make mornings their own. After the long mornings came the heart of a Soviet soldier's life, the endless cycle of drills and discipline. If the morning routine had been a warm-up, the afternoon was the main event, where men were tested again and again to prove that their bodies and minds belonged entirely to the Red Army life. In uniform meant constant movement, constant correction, and constant repetition. Every day was designed to grind away individuality and replace it with unity. Once the morning breakfast and early drills were finished, the soldiers were ordered into the training fields. These could be large open squares inside a garrison, or wide stretches of muddy countryside depending on where the unit was stationed. The training field was where men learned to move like parts of one machine. Marching in step was more than just formality. It was a demonstration of power. A column of hundreds of men moving as one made officers proud and sent a message that the Red Army was unbreakable. For the men themselves, it was tiring. Sometimes they would march for hours, knees lifting high boots slamming into the ground until blisters formed on their feet. Yet they pushed on because marching in perfect order was considered as vital as carrying a rifle. Weapons training took up another enormous part of the day. The standard issue rifle was the Mosin Nagant, a weapon that many soldiers could take apart and reassemble blindfolded because they had done it thousands of times over. Rifles were disassembled, cleaned, oiled, and reassembled until every movement became instinct. Ammunition was carefully rationed, so live firing exercises were not as common as drills with empty weapons. Still, the moments when soldiers could actually fire at targets were unforgettable. The deafening crack of the rifle echoing across the field gave them a sense of reality, a reminder that their endless drills were not just for show. Beyond rifles, soldiers trained with bayonets, grenades, and occasionally heavier weapons like machine guns or mortars. Bayonet training was especially brutal. Soldiers lined up and lunged at stuffed dummies with fierce shouts. Officers wanted aggression drilled into them, so that when the moment came, they would not hesitate. To drive steel into the enemy grenade, training involved wooden or dummy grenades tossed into fields, so soldiers could practice diving for cover or timing their throws. The exercises often left men covered in mud, bruised from hitting the ground, again and again. But this was exactly the point. The Soviet system believed that hardship built strength. Not every drill was about fighting directly. Some were about survival. Soldiers learned to crawl through barbed wire mud, soaking their uniforms, while machine gun fire cracked overhead. Sometimes it was live ammunition whizzing just above their heads, a terrifying but effective way to remind them to stay low. They practiced digging trenches, setting up camp in freezing weather and marching long distances with heavy packs that cut into their shoulders. The Red Army wanted every soldier prepared for the worst, and the worst was often exactly what they experienced in training. Political education followed them into these fields as well. Commissars walked among the men giving speeches about the honor of serving the Soviet Union, about the evil of capitalism, and the duty of every worker turned soldier to defend the homeland. These lessons were not optional. Soldiers repeated slogans, aloud, saluting portraits of Lenin and Stalin that sometimes hung even in training grounds. To the outside observer, it might have looked like brainwashing, and in many ways it was. But to the soldiers themselves, it was just another drill, another thing to endure before the day was done. Discipline remained the thread that tied all these drills together. Officers shouted commands and expected instant obedience. There was no room for hesitation. If a soldier moved too slowly or made a mistake, the entire unit might be punished. This created a sense of collective responsibility where one man's failure became everyone's burden. Sometimes punishments were physical: extra push-ups, forced marches with heavy packs, or humiliating chores, like cleaning latrines. Other times punishments were harsher confinement in cold guardhouses, or even worse, a soldier quickly learned that the easiest path was total obedience. Despite the harshness, there were moments when the men bonded more deeply, through shared struggle. Marching in the pouring rain, or crawling side by side through icy mud, forged a kind of brotherhood. Hardship was a language they all spoke. When one soldier stumbled, another would reach out to drag him forward, because falling behind meant the wrath of officers would come down on everyone. In these moments, a strange kind of loyalty was born not to the system, not to the ideology, but to the man standing next to you. The Red Army may have been built on politics and discipline, but its heart was still comradeship. Afternoons could feel endless as drills stretched hour after hour. The body ached, the stomach groaned for food, and yet the schedule continued. The Red Army was not concerned with comfort. A soldier was a tool, and a tool had to be sharpened endlessly. Soldiers sometimes joked quietly among themselves that they would be able to assemble a rifle in their sleep, or march all the way across Russia without stopping. But even the jokes were whispered because officers were always near, and laughter at the wrong moment could bring punishment. When fatigue set in, the drills did not stop. That was often the point. The officers wanted to see men perform tasks not only when rested, but when utterly exhausted. A real battle would not wait until a soldier had enough sleep or food, so the training was built to break limits. When a soldier's legs trembled from endless marches, he was ordered to run. When his arms ached from holding his rifle, he was told to lift it again. The message was clear. The needs of the state were greater than the needs of the individual. As evening crept closer, the drills finally began to slow. The soldiers often staggered back to the barracks uniforms, caked with mud sweat dripping down their faces. Every muscle ached, and yet there was little sympathy offered by the officers. The Red Army did not pamper its soldiers. It expected endurance to become second nature. Looking back at these long afternoons, one can see how the Soviet Union shaped its army not through luxury or comfort, but through repetition and hardship. Daily life was not about glory, but about grinding away resistance until every soldier moved thought and fought as one. That is what made the Soviet soldier both feared and pitied. Feared because he could endure suffering longer than many enemies. Pitied because his individuality was sacrificed to an unyielding system. So when we ask what a Soviet soldier did in daily life, we must look beyond the battles they drilled, marched, crawled, trained, and endured until their very bodies became tools of the state. Every day was a test of obedience and survival, and though the system was harsh, the men found strength in each other. Shoulders pressed together under the same burden, united not by ideology, but by the shared experience of living through endless drills and discipline. If mornings were about rising early and training the body, and afternoons were about discipline and endless drills, then the next part of a Soviet soldier's daily life was about food, rest, and whatever small escapes he could find in a world that was otherwise tightly controlled. To understand how these men endured such a rigid system, we need to step into their mess halls, their barracks, and the rare quiet moments that gave them the strength to face another day. Food was one of the biggest concerns for soldiers, because the quality and quantity often left much to be desired. The Red Army was massive, feeding millions of men across the Soviet Union and beyond, and resources were stretched thin. Breakfast was already simple, but lunch and dinner were not much better. In most barracks, the mess hall was a large plain room with wooden tables, benches, and the constant smell of cabbage and boiled grains. The meals usually consisted of black rye bread, watery soups made from cabbage, potatoes or barley, and sometimes thin cuts of meat when supplies allowed. During wartime, these rations became even smaller, sometimes reduced to little more than bread and soup with almost no protein at all. For many soldiers, the monotony of meals was as hard to endure as the hunger itself. Imagine eating the same watery soup day after day, with the occasional potato floating inside and a small slice of bread on the side. Salt was a luxury sugar. Even more so, coffee was rare. Tea was more common. Though weak and often bitter, soldiers joked that the best seasoning for Soviet food was hunger itself, and in many cases, that was true. A man who had spent hours crawling through mud or running across frozen fields would eat anything placed in front of him. Despite the bland food, the mess hall could be a lively place. Men crowded shoulder to shoulder, talking loudly as they shoveled down their meals. Officers often sat at separate tables, receiving slightly better portions, which did not go unnoticed by the rank and file. Still, soldiers made the most of the time. In some units, men sang folk songs from their villages while eating. Others played small games with crusts of bread, betting on who could finish their soup fastest. These simple interactions gave life to an otherwise dull part of the day. The food may not have been good, but the company of comrades made it bearable. After meals came brief periods of rest. Soldiers might have an hour or two in the afternoon before evening, drills or duties, and this was the time they cherished most. Rest did not always mean sleeping, though many collapsed on their bunks the moment they could. It might mean sitting quietly, cleaning boots or uniforms, or writing letters home. Letters were an emotional lifeline. Soldiers wrote about their health, about missing their families, about village gossip. They remembered from before they were conscripted. Some letters were censored by officers who screened for unapproved comments. But even so, writing allowed men to feel human again. For entertainment, the choices were limited, but soldiers were resourceful. Cards were a favorite pastime. Soldiers played for scraps of bread or for pride alone. A deck of cards could turn a dull barracks into a small theatre of competition and laughter. Others whittled wood-carved small figures or fixed their uniforms and boots to pass the time. Some units had access to harmonicas, balalaikas, or other simple instruments, and music filled the air during these short breaks. For a few minutes, men could forget they were cogs in a massive military machine and remember that they were still individuals with voices, songs, and jokes. Sleep was another part of daily life that revealed much about the soldiers. Existent soldiers slept in long rows of bunks close together with little privacy. The barracks often smelled of sweat, damp uniforms, and food from the mess hall. It was not comfortable, and yet men adapted quickly. A blanket folded tightly around. The body could mean the difference between warmth and a shivering night in winter. Boots were often placed neatly beneath the bed, and personal belongings tucked into small pouches or shelves. Discipline extended even into sleep. Each man was expected to keep his sleeping area neat because inspections could occur at any time. Nights were not always quiet. Sometimes soldiers were woken for night duties, like guard shifts patrolling the perimeter of the camp or standing watch at gates. A few hours of sleep could be interrupted at any moment by the call of duty. Soldiers learned to sleep lightly because they never knew when they might be shaken awake by an officer demanding their presence. Even in peacetime, the Red Army lived in a constant state of readiness. For many men, the only real escape came through their comradeship. Daily life was hard, food was bland, and discipline was unrelenting, but friendship turned these struggles into shared burdens. Soldiers supported each other in small ways, sharing extra bread if one man was especially hungry, or helping to clean a rifle when a comrade was too exhausted. They told stories about home, about their villages, about girls they had known before the army, and about dreams they held for the future. These conversations reminded them that life existed beyond the barracks walls. Alcohol played a role as well, though it was not always officially allowed. Vodka was part of Russian culture, and soldiers sometimes managed to acquire bottles through local villagers or black market trades. When they did, nights could turn rowdy. Men drank, sang, and sometimes fought with each other. But even these fights often ended with laughter and embraces. The harshness of daily life created a need for release, and alcohol gave them a temporary escape from the constant watchfulness of officers. Religion too lingered quietly in the lives of some soldiers, though the Soviet Union was officially atheist. Many men came from deeply religious villages, where Orthodox Christianity shaped daily life. In the army, open worship was frowned upon, but soldiers still made the sign of the cross in secret, whispered prayers before battles, or kept small icons tucked away in their belongings. Faith was another form of escape, a way to find strength in a system that tried to strip individuality away. When night finally fell and soldiers lay in their bunks, exhaustion usually pulled them into deep sleep despite the noise of snoring comrades or the occasional creak of footsteps from night patrols. The Red Army had a way of wearing men down until rest became irresistible. The days were so long, so filled with labor drills and duties, that even a thin mattress and a scratchy blanket felt like heaven. Looking at this part of a Soviet soldier's life, we see men caught between hardship and humanity. Their meals were plain, their rest brief, and their escapes limited. Yet within those boundaries, they built small worlds of comfort. A game of cards, a song, shared with comrades, a secret prayer, or a letter home. All these things gave meaning to lives otherwise dominated by discipline. So when we ask what a Soviet soldier did in his daily life, the answer is not only drilling or marching, it is also eating plain soup with laughter in the mess hall. It is carving small figures to pass the time. It is writing letters that carried dreams and memories back to distant villages. It is finding small escapes within a system that tried to allow none. These escapes, no matter how small, were what kept soldiers human amid the relentless machinery of the Soviet Union. By the time a Soviet soldier reached the middle of his day, he had already endured hours of training drills and meager meals. Yet his work was far from over, because being a soldier in the Red Army was not only about fighting or preparing to fight. It was about constant duties, relentless discipline, and the feeling that someone was always watching your every move. To understand this part of a soldier's daily life, we have to look at the routines that filled their afternoons and evenings. One of the most common duties assigned to soldiers was guard duty. A soldier might be ordered to stand watch at the gates of the barracks, patrol the perimeter of the camp, or guard supply depots and weapons stores. These assignments could last for hours in the burning sun of summer or the freezing winds of winter. Standing still for long periods with a rifle in hand tested not only physical endurance, but mental discipline. A soldier had to remain alert even when his body begged for rest, because mistakes in guard duty were taken very seriously. A lapse could mean stolen supplies, desertions, or worse, and punishment for failure was severe. Other daily duties revolved around maintaining the barracks and campgrounds. Soldiers were expected to clean, sweep and scrub floors, polish boots, repair uniforms, and even tend to gardens that provided extra vegetables for the mess hall. These chores might seem menial, but they were considered essential by the Soviet system because cleanliness, order, and productivity reflected the strength of the army. Every bed had to be tightly made, every hallway spotless, every boot shined to a near mirror finish. A soldier's pride was measured not only in his skill with a rifle, but in the sharpness of his uniform and the shine of his belt buckle. Evenings often included inspections. Officers or political commissars would walk through the barracks, checking bunks, uniforms, and rifles. A wrinkle in a blanket, a speck of dust on a weapon, or an untucked shirt could bring punishment. The purpose of these inspections went far beyond cleanliness. They reinforced the idea that no part of a soldier's life was his own. Everything had to conform to the standards of the Red Army. These inspections kept men in a constant state of alertness because even in their supposed rest hours, they were still being judged. Political education never stopped either. In the evenings, soldiers often attended mandatory meetings where commissars delivered speeches on Marxism, Leninism, and loyalty to the state. Soldiers sat on wooden benches, listening to long lectures that emphasized their duty as defenders of socialism. Often these meetings stretched late into the night, and while many soldiers were too exhausted to focus, they had no choice but to attend. Falling asleep during political lectures was dangerous and could lead to harsh consequences. The Red Army believed that ideology was as important as weaponry, and so soldiers had to absorb the lessons whether they wanted to or not. Beyond duties and lectures, soldiers were constantly aware of surveillance. The Soviet Union was built on suspicion, and that atmosphere extended into the army. Political commissars and secret informants kept close watch for any sign of disloyalty or disobedience. A careless word spoken in frustration, a joke about an officer, or even the wrong tone when speaking of the state could be reported and bring serious consequences. Sometimes men were arrested or punished, not for what they did, but for what someone claimed they said. This fear created a heavy silence in the barracks at times, because soldiers knew that any man could be an informant. Still, despite the weight of constant supervision, soldiers found ways to endure. Some learned to speak in codes or half-jokes that only their closest comrades understood. Others simply kept quiet, saving their true thoughts for letters home, or for the rare moments of trust when they knew they were safe. Many soldiers adopted a survival mindset. Focus on the tasks at hand, obey orders, keep your head down, and do not draw attention. In a system that punished individuality, silence often became the safest choice. But there was another side to discipline in the Red Army. It was not only about fear, it was also about creating unity. While harsh punishments and strict routines might seem unbearable, they did forge bonds among the men. Everyone endured the same hardships together, and that created solidarity. A soldier could look at the man next to him and know that he too had stood in the cold for hours, on guard duty, had been shouted at during inspections, had endured the same bland meals. This shared suffering was a kind of glue, holding the soldiers together. With all the discipline, there were occasional moments of relief. For instance, after completing long duties, some units allowed limited recreation evenings. Soldiers might gather to watch a film played from an old projector, or listen to a small performance of music arranged by comrades who could sing or play instruments. The films were often Soviet propaganda pieces celebrating the glory of the state, or heroic tales of workers and peasants. But for the soldiers, even this was better than nothing. The simple act of watching a movie or hearing music gave them a taste of normal life. Daily duties also taught soldiers important lessons about adaptability. Unlike modern armies where many tasks are handled by support staff, Soviet soldiers were often expected to do everything themselves. They cooked, repaired, sewed, and built what they needed. A soldier might spend his morning learning how to fire a rifle and his evening fixing broken boots with scraps of leather. This versatility was by design. The Soviet Union prepared its soldiers to survive in conditions where supplies might be scarce and support distant. Even the harsh surveillance had strange effects. Sometimes it drove men apart, making them wary of one another, but other times it pushed them closer. Only the closest friendships survived the constant fear of informants, and those friendships often became stronger than family ties. Men trusted their comrades with secrets they would never dare write in letters. They confided dreams, fears, and frustrations in hushed voices late at night, knowing that the man lying in the bunk beside them was the only one who truly understood what they endured. The life of duties, discipline, and surveillance was not glamorous, but it was central to the daily existence of a Soviet soldier. It shaped how he thought, how he behaved, and how he interacted with others. Every action was monitored, every corner of the barracks inspected, every word weighed for loyalty. Yet within that cage, soldiers still found ways to live. They cleaned their rifles until they shone. They stood guard against the cold. They whispered jokes to their closest friends, and they endured. Because endurance, more than anything, was the measure of a Soviet soldier. When we ask what a Soviet soldier did in his daily life, we must look beyond the training and the battles. We must see the hours of guard duty and biting winds, the endless cleaning of barracks, the tense silence during political lectures, and the careful glances exchanged with comrades under the watchful eye of commissars. Daily life was shaped by duties and discipline, by the knowledge that freedom was limited and that someone was always listening. Yet even in that heavy atmosphere, men found strength in each other and in the small acts of resilience that kept their humanity alive. When we look at the daily life of a Soviet soldier, it is easy to focus only on the harsh discipline, endless training, and constant surveillance. Yet behind all the rigid order, there existed another world, a quieter human side that kept men alive, both physically and emotionally. Because without laughter, friendship, and small acts of kindness, the weight of army life would have crushed many soldiers. To understand this side of their lives, we have to look at their bonds of camaraderie, the stories they shared, and the ways they clung to their humanity inside a system designed to strip individuality away. Camaraderie was one of the most important survival tools in the Red Army. Soldiers came from every corner of the vast Soviet Union, from Ukrainian villages, Siberian towns, Central Asian steppes, and Russian cities. Men who in civilian life might never have met found themselves side by side in the same barracks. They spoke different dialects, some even different languages, but military life forced them together. At first, these differences created friction, misunderstandings, and sometimes even fights. Yet over time, shared struggle created bonds that could feel stronger than blood. Friendship among soldiers was forged in hardship. Long marches, under heavy packs, crawling through mud during drills, eating the same bland meals, or shivering together during night guard duty built trust. A soldier knew that the man next to him understood exactly what he was going through. When one man's boots wore out, a comrade might share patches of leather. When a soldier fell ill, His comrades covered his duties quietly so he could rest without punishment. These small acts of care were lifelines that gave meaning to lives otherwise filled with orders. And repetition storytelling was another powerful way soldiers bonded. In the evenings after long drills, men gathered in barracks sharing tales from home. Some told stories of farm life describing the harvests or the struggles of village winters. Others spoke of city life, of crowded apartments, noisy markets, or factories with endless machines. Many stories circled back to families. Soldiers spoke of mothers cooking simple meals, of fathers working in fields, or factories of brothers and sisters left behind. Every story reminded them of a world beyond the camp walls, and hearing those words helped them endure. Some soldiers told stories of war itself. Veterans who had survived earlier battles or conflicts shared memories of combat. Sometimes they spoke with pride of victories and bravery. Other times their words carried a heavy silence as they recalled friends lost and horrors witnessed. These stories gave younger soldiers both fear and courage. Fear of what awaited them if war came. Again, but also courage in knowing that men had endured before them and survived. In this way, oral storytelling became both education and therapy. Humor played a crucial role too. In a world where every action was monitored, laughter became an act of rebellion. Soldiers joked about the tasteless soup, comparing it to dirty dishwater, or teased each other about marching like clumsy geese. They made light of the constant inspections, imagining absurd scenarios where commissars demanded spotless boots even in the middle of a battlefield. These jokes were whispered. Of course, never spoken loudly in front of officers, but inside the barracks, they were medicine. Humor softened the edges of harsh reality and reminded men that they were still. Human music was another escape. Soldiers from villages often brought songs with them, folk tunes that carried the spirit of their homeland. A man with a harmonica or balalaika could transform the mood of an entire barracks in minutes. Soon, others would join clapping, singing, tapping boots against wooden floors. These songs were not only entertainment, they were memory and connection. The lyrics reminded men of their mothers, their lovers, their childhood homes. For a moment, the barracks felt less like a prison and more like a gathering of friends. Relationships extended beyond the barracks as well. When soldiers were stationed in towns or near villages, they sometimes formed connections with civilians. Local women sometimes befriended, or even secretly courted soldiers, despite strict rules against such fraternization. For the soldiers, these moments of human connection were invaluable. They reminded them that life was not only about uniforms, drills, and ideology, but also about affection, warmth, and companionship. Even brief encounters left deep impressions that soldiers carried with them for years. Another part of camaraderie came through shared rebellion. Soldiers could not openly disobey orders, but they found small ways to push back against the system. Sometimes this meant sneaking extra food from the mess hall or hiding a bottle of vodka brought in from outside. Other times it meant quietly mocking an unpopular officer when he was out of earshot. These small acts of defiance built unity among soldiers, reinforcing the feeling that they were in it together against not only enemies abroad, but also the hardships of their own system. Religious faith also connected soldiers in subtle ways. Though the Soviet Union discouraged religion, many men still held onto their beliefs. They shared prayers quietly before bed, or carried small icons hidden in their belongings. These shared rituals brought comfort. A soldier who crossed himself before sleep might notice, a comrade doing the same, and a silent bond formed between them. Faith was not only about religion, but about hope and meaning, in a life that often felt stripped of both. Letters from home played another central role. Soldiers would gather when mail arrived, eager to hear news from their families. Reading a letter aloud or sharing parts of it with friends created joy that rippled through the barracks. Even those who did not receive mail felt lifted by the happiness of others, because it reminded them that the outside world still existed. For soldiers who never received letters, comrades often stepped in, writing words of encouragement or pretending that a message had been delayed. This compassion showed the strength of their bonds. In the rare moments of free time, soldiers often gathered in circles to discuss dreams of the future. Some talked about going back to their villages to farm again. Others dreamed of city life, working in factories or studying at universities. A few even dared to imagine traveling abroad. Though these dreams were often unrealistic or impossible, they mattered. They gave soldiers hope and something to hold on to beyond the endless drills. They reminded them that their lives did not belong entirely to the Red Army. These bonds of friendship, storytelling, humor, music, and faith gave Soviet soldiers the strength to face their daily struggles. Without them, the system would have broken many more men. The Red Army relied on discipline, ideology, and constant surveillance, but the soldiers themselves relied on each other. The human side of military life was what made it bearable, what transformed endless monotony into shared survival. So when we ask what a Soviet soldier did in his daily life, the answer cannot be told in drills and duties alone. It must also include the laughter shared over bland soup, the songs sung in barracks, the secret prayers whispered before sleep, the letters read aloud, and the dreams quietly discussed with trusted friends. Because while the system demanded obedience, the men built their own world of camaraderie, and in that world they found their humanity. As the long day in the life of a Soviet soldier drew to a close, there was always a quiet shift in the atmosphere. The noise of marching feet, the barking of orders, the clanging of mess hall trays all faded into the background, replaced by the stillness of evening. For many soldiers, this was the only part of the day that truly belonged to them, a brief moment between the rigid structure of duty and the surrender of sleep. In this final chapter, we explore how soldiers reflected on their lives during these moments, what they thought about, what they feared, what they hoped for, and how they prepared themselves for yet another day in the vast machinery of the Red Army. When lights dimmed in the barracks and boots were lined neatly by bunks, men often sat silently on their beds. Some took out letters from home, rereading them over and over, as if each word could anchor them to a different world. A simple greeting from a mother or a note from a sweetheart could spark a wave of emotions. Some men smiled quietly. Some blinked back tears, and some simply stared at the paper as if trying to memorize the handwriting. These letters were treasures more valuable than medals because they were proof that someone somewhere remembered them. Others filled. This time with writing letters home were not only updates about daily routines, but also emotional lifelines. Soldiers wrote about the weather, the food, the inspections, and sometimes the small joys of the day. They described the songs sung in the barracks or the jokes shared with friends. But between the lines, they often asked about loved ones with aching hearts. They wanted to know if crops had grown well, if siblings were healthy, if neighbors still remembered their names. Every envelope, sealed and sent, was a piece of themselves. They offered to the people they missed. Not every soldier had someone to write to. Some were orphans. Others had lost families during the wars or lived too far away for reliable mail delivery. For these men, the quiet hours were heavier, yet even they found ways to reflect. Sometimes they kept journals, scribbling thoughts in cheap notebooks or scraps of paper. These writings were often simple sentences describing what they had done or how they felt. But even this small act gave them a sense of control over their own story. In a system that often treated them like faceless cogs, conversations in the evening were different from those during the day. They were softer, slower, and more honest soldiers. Talked about their childhoods, about the girls they had loved, about teachers who had believed in them or not. Some spoke of dreams that had been interrupted by conscription. A boy who once wanted to be a musician now carried a rifle. A young man who dreamed of becoming a doctor now polished boots in a barracks. Still, these conversations were not always sad. Sometimes they were filled with quiet pride in surviving another day, or even gentle laughter at shared memories. The barracks at night were places of paradox. They were cramped loud with snoring and creaking bunks, yet somehow intimate and comforting. The smell of wool blankets mixed with the faint scent of soap and tobacco. A lantern might still burn in a corner, casting warm light over men sitting cross-legged on their bunks or leaning against walls. With each passing hour, the room grew quieter, until the only sounds left were breathing and the occasional turning of a body in sleep. Some soldiers prayed before bed, even though religion was officially discouraged or mocked by the Soviet system. A man might pull a small icon from his pocket, kiss it silently, and tuck it under his pillow. Another might simply close his eyes and whisper a prayer in his mind. These small rituals brought peace. They reminded the soldier that there was something larger than the barracks, larger than the army, even larger than the state. For some, it was God; for others, it was family; for others, still, it was the idea of truth and justice. Each man held on to something different, but each needed that anchor to make it through. Physical exhaustion also played a role in these quiet hours. The daily grind of training drills, physical labor guard duty, and marching left. Most men completely drained. By the time the lights went out, muscles ached, backs throbbed, and eyelids grew heavy. Even so, some soldiers lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the future. Some wondered how many months or years they had left before demobilization. Others wondered if they would be sent to a war zone, wondering if they would survive. Some thought about going home and whether home would still feel like home when they got there. There were moments when a soldier would sit outside the barracks just for a few minutes, breathing in the night air. If the unit was stationed in the countryside, stars would spread across the sky in breathtaking silence. The soldier might hear crickets or the wind rustling through trees. For a moment, he could pretend he was back in his village, lying in the grass as a boy. These moments were fleeting, but powerful. They reminded the soldier that the world was still beautiful, even if he could not touch it fully. In urban garrisons, the view might be rooftops and chimneys instead of stars, yet even there soldiers found meaning. A dim streetlight glowing through fog, a cat darting across an alley, the muffled laughter of civilians in the distance, all reminded the soldier that civilian life still existed beyond the barbed wire fences. It was a bittersweet reminder, but it gave hope that one day they too would return to that world. For those who had already served many months or years, the night hours were also times of reflection on change. They thought about how military life had shaped them, how they had grown stronger or colder or more disciplined. Some noticed they laughed less easily than before. Others realized they were more patient, more observant, or more loyal to their comrades. These reflections were rarely spoken aloud, but they lived in the minds of soldiers as they drifted towards sleep. And sleep, when it came, was deep and often dreamless. The body simply shut down from exhaustion, yet for some dreams did come. Dreams of home, of parents, of first loves, of fields and forests, of schoolyards and kitchens, of warmth and safety. Others dreamed of the future, of freedom, of new lives beyond the army. These dreams were both blessing and curse because they reminded soldiers of what they missed, but also gave them strength to endure another day. As dawn approached and the bugle call echoed through the camp, the quiet ended abruptly. The lights snapped on. Boots were laced uniforms, straightened beds tightened, and the machinery of military life roared back to life. But for a few precious hours, the soldier had been simply a man. A man with memories, with fears, with hopes, and with a heart still beating beneath the uniform. In these quiet nightly rituals, in these silent reflections, and whispered dreams, we find the full humanity of the Soviet soldier. The daily life of drills, orders, and discipline was only one side of their experience. The other side was this deeply personal, emotional interior world. This was the part that gave them strength. This was the part that allowed them to survive not only physically, but spiritually. Because no matter how powerful the state or how strict the discipline, at the end of the day, the soldier remained a human being. And it was this human being that lay in bed each night thinking, feeling, remembering, and preparing to face tomorrow.